The light came through curtains he did not recognize. Nolan Perry opened his eyes and held still. The ceiling was too high. The sheets smelled like lavender, not the cedar detergent he bought in bulk. His work boots sat by the door, placed there by hands that were not his. His shirt was untucked, 2 buttons open, and he was lying on top of the covers, fully dressed, like someone who had meant to leave but never made it to standing. Brooke Alderman leaned against the doorframe of her own bedroom, a white mug in one hand. She had been watching him. She did not pretend otherwise. She smiled. Last night was fun. Nolan sat up slowly. The party, the walk, the conversation that kept going past every reasonable hour. He remembered all of it. He just did not know what any of it meant yet. The distance between the doorframe and the edge of the bed was 8 feet, maybe 9. Neither of them moved to close it. What happened at that company party, and what Brooke is about to discover in a personnel file marked with his name, will change everything between them. Stay for this one. 6 hours before that morning, Nolan had been standing in his kitchen on the east side of Richmond, Virginia, packing 2 lunches into brown paper bags. One for himself, one for his son. Jake Perry was 9 years old, and he sat at the kitchen table the way he always did, quiet, focused, turning a half-finished model airplane between careful fingers. The fuselage was balsa wood, sanded smooth, and Jake held it up to the window light to check the seam where the wing joined the body. He did not ask for help. He rarely did. Nolan set a sandwich in front of him and leaned against the counter. The kitchen was small, clean, and underlit. A rental they had moved into 2 years ago when everything else stopped making sense. Catherine had been gone since the fall of 2022. A stroke, sudden, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of loss that does not arrive with warning signs or a chance to prepare. After that, the world Nolan had built simply refused to hold its shape. Before Catherine, he had been someone else entirely. For 11 years, Nolan Perry had worked as a certified commercial appraiser for Hargrove Valuation Group, one of the largest valuation firms in the Mid-Atlantic. He held an MAI designation, the credential that let him walk into a $40 million office tower and tell a bank, within 5%, what it was worth. Shopping centers, industrial parks, waterfront developments. He could read a cap rate the way most people read a clock. After Catherine, he stopped. Not with a letter or a scene. He just did not go back. Could not sit at the desk. Could not pretend the numbers mattered more than the fact that the woman who used to bring him coffee at that desk was gone. He let his license lapse. Eventually, the firm stopped calling. He found a listing for a maintenance supervisor at Alderman Realty Group. Over 40 commercial properties across Richmond, portfolio north of $300 million. He applied because the work was physical, outdoors, and required no decisions about value. They hired him in a week. Alderman Realty had been built over 3 decades by Robert Alderman, a quiet, methodical man who had started with a single strip mall on Hull Street and grown the operation one building at a time. Robert died in the spring of 2023, and his daughter Brooke had taken over. Brooke Alderman was 35. She had worked under her father for 6 years before his death, learning the business from the leasing side up, but inheriting the CEO title and earning the trust of the board were 2 entirely separate accomplishments. The 7-member board was split, 3 behind her, 2 openly skeptical, and 2 who changed direction depending on the quarter. Most of the skepticism traced back to one man. Victor Lund was 51, the company's vice president of acquisitions, and Robert Alderman's first hire 18 years ago. He had personally sourced more than half the properties in the current portfolio. He was polite with Brooke in meetings, deferential in hallways, and quietly dismissive everywhere else. He believed the company should have gone to someone with tenure, someone who had earned it in the field, someone like him. Barb Overton was 60 and had been with Alderman longer than anyone except Victor. Her title was property records clerk, but she maintained every lease, acquisition folder, and tax document the company had generated in 3 decades. If a piece of paper existed inside Alderman Realty, Barb could locate it in 4 minutes. The company's annual holiday party was set for the 2nd Saturday in December, held at one of Alderman's own properties, a renovated warehouse event space in Shockoe Bottom with exposed brick and 30-foot ceilings. All employees were invited, from property managers to maintenance. Nolan had not attended in the 2 years since he was hired. He had no reason to go and several reasons not to. But this year, Jake had a sleepover at a friend's house that Saturday night, and the apartment would sit empty, and Nolan found himself ironing a shirt he had not worn in over a year. He adjusted Jake's collar before dropping him off. Jake looked up at him from the doorstep. "You look weird," Jake said. "Thanks." "No, like, nice weird." Nolan watched him disappear through the front door, then sat in the truck for a long moment before pulling out toward Shockoe Bottom. The party was already filling up when Nolan arrived. 160 employees spread across a room built for 200, the overhead lights dimmed to something between festive and forgiving. Nolan found a spot near the far wall, between a column and a high-top table, and stayed there with a glass of water he never finished. Brooke was working the room. Handshake, eye contact, name recall, the whole choreography of authority performed under string lights. By the time she circled back toward the bar, the energy was thinning at the edges. She noticed Nolan the way you notice the one person in a room who is not moving. Leaning against the column, jacket over one arm, watching the crowd without joining it. She did not recognize him. Maintenance staff rarely crossed paths with the executive floor. She walked over because he was the first person all night who was not mid-sentence when she arrived. "You look like you are thinking about leaving," she said. "Been thinking about it since I walked in." They talked. Not about the company. About Richmond. About Churchill at 6 in the morning. About a bookstore on Carey Street that kept irregular hours. About silence and what it meant when it stopped being uncomfortable between two people who had no reason to be comfortable with each other. By 11, the catering staff was breaking down the bar. Brooke lived 4 blocks away. They walked together. Her condo was on the second floor of a converted row house. Hardwood floors, tall windows. They sat on the couch. She opened a bottle her father had kept in the cabinet, one she had never had a reason to uncork. They did not toast. At some point she walked toward her bedroom and gestured at the wall above her dresser. A framed photograph, faded, slightly crooked, of a single-story brick building on Hull Street. The first property Robert Alderman ever bought. She had hung it here because it was the only room visitors never saw. Nolan followed her in. They sat on the edge of the bed and talked about fathers, and the things they build, and what it costs to inherit something you did not start. The conversation did not end. It just got quieter. Sometime after 3, the silences won. They fell asleep on top of the covers, fully clothed, a pillow's width between them. Nothing happened. Everything shifted. Morning came. Nolan opened his eyes. His boots had been placed by the door. He did not remember taking them off. Brooke stood in the doorway, coffee in hand, and smiled. Last night was fun. He left 20 minutes later, walking through Churchill in yesterday's clothes. The air was colder now, sharper. Monday came like a verdict. Someone from the warehouse had seen them leave together. A property manager on the same block had seen Nolan walking out of her building at sunrise. By 9, the story had circled through maintenance, dispatch, and 2 property teams. Victor heard by 10. By noon, he had requested a word with the board chair. Not a formal complaint, just a carefully phrased concern about a pattern of judgment from the CEO. HR pulled Nolan's personnel file. Application, emergency contacts, tax forms, routine. But clipped behind the second page was his full employment history, submitted at onboarding and never examined since. Nolan James Perry, MAI designated commercial appraiser. 11 years with Hargrove Valuation Group. High-value commercial properties. Portfolio appraised. $2 billion across 6 states. The HR director read it twice, then walked it to Brooke's office. The man who had fallen asleep in her bedroom. The quiet maintenance supervisor who patched drywall and never said more than a handful of words in a hallway, had spent a decade telling banks what their buildings were worth. He had never mentioned it. Not at the party. Not at 2 in the morning, when they had talked about everything except the lives they used to lead. The HR review concluded within 48 hours. No company policy had been violated. Attendance at a voluntary social event was not a disciplinary matter, and there was no evidence of misconduct beyond proximity and gossip. The case was closed, and a brief summary was sent to the board chair confirming clearance. Victor received the update at his desk. He read it, set it face down, and did not leave his office for the rest of the afternoon. The play had failed, but the instinct behind it had not gone anywhere. He had spent 18 years building something at this company, acquiring properties, expanding the portfolio, making himself indispensable. A 35-year-old inheritor and a maintenance worker were not going to undo that. He just needed to wait. Brooke, meanwhile, did not confront Nolan. She did not ask him why he had left a career that paid 4 times his current salary, or why he had chosen to sand drywall in buildings he was qualified to appraise. She simply began watching differently. She noticed the way he looked at structures, not at paint or signage or landscaping, the things tenants and investors noticed first. Nolan looked at foundation lines, at the angle where a roof line met a parapet wall, at hairline fractures in load-bearing columns that most people would mistake for cosmetic settling. He looked the way someone looks who has spent years calculating what a building can carry and what it cannot. 3 weeks after the party, Victor brought a new acquisition proposal to the board. A warehouse complex on Midlothian Turnpike, 112,000 square feet across 3 buildings, zoned for light industrial, accompanied by an appraisal valuing the property at $8.4 million. Victor presented the deal as a growth opportunity. Below market vacancy, strong tenant mix, room for rent escalation. The numbers were clean. The narrative was persuasive. Brooke reviewed the package that evening at her desk. The cap rate felt compressed, tighter than she would expect for that submarket and that asset class. The price per square foot was 20% above the comps she could pull from public databases. But commercial appraisal was not her training. She did not have the technical vocabulary to challenge a credentialed report signed by a licensed professional. She signed the board approval. The pen felt heavier than it should have. When she set it down, she stared at the Greystone appraisal logo on the cover page for a long time, trying to name the thing that was bothering her. She could not. Not yet. Brooke began visiting properties. She called them quarterly inspections, a CEO walking the grounds, checking on tenants, doing due diligence. 3 sites the first week, 2 the next. She brought a clipboard and asked questions she already knew the answers to. She noted roof conditions, parking lot maintenance, signage compliance. Standard executive walkthroughs, performed with appropriate formality. What she was actually doing was finding reasons to be in the same space as Nolan Perry. He was always somewhere on site, replacing a ballast in a parking deck fixture, recalibrating a thermostat in a vacant suite, walking a fence line with a tape measure and a level. He worked the way he spoke, carefully, without wasted motion, with a kind of focus that made even the smallest repair look considered. They talked, briefly, professionally, about compressor cycles and drainage grades, and whether a retaining wall on the Broad Street property needed reinforcement or just repointing. The conversations were technical and safe, but the charge from the party night sat underneath every exchange like a current, not in what they said, but in the geometry of what they avoided. The half-second too long before one of them looked away. The distance they maintained, always precisely far enough to be appropriate and precisely close enough to feel deliberate. On a Thursday afternoon at a strip mall off Staples Mill Road, Nolan mentioned, almost as an aside, while fitting a replacement gutter bracket, that a roof replacement Victor had approved the previous quarter was priced about 40% above what that scope of work typically cost. He said it the way a mechanic mentions a loose bolt. Factual, unweighted. Then he bent back to the bracket, and the conversation moved on. Brooke wrote it down when she reached her car. She sat there for several minutes, engine off, staring at the number she had written on the back of a lease renewal form. 40%. She did not know what it meant, but she knew it meant something. Victor, meanwhile, was paying attention. Not to the number. He did not know about that. He noticed the pattern. Brooke's truck parked at 3 different properties the same week, each time in the lot nearest to whatever building Nolan was working on. He noticed her walking back from a maintenance bay with her clipboard tucked under her arm and something in her posture that had nothing to do with quarterly inspections. He began keeping a log. Dates, properties, duration of visits. He did not know what he was assembling yet, but he was assembling it carefully, the way a man does when he has spent 18 years learning how to protect what is his. 3 weeks later, Victor presented another acquisition to the board. A retail strip on West Broad Street. 6 units, 90% occupied, freshly paved lot, with an appraisal valuing the property at $6.1 million. The appraisal was performed by Greystone Appraisal LLC. Brooke paused. She had seen that name before. She let the meeting continue, asked the appropriate questions, and took the package back to her office without signing it. She pulled the Midlothian warehouse file from her cabinet. The appraisal on that property, the one that had felt too high, the one she had signed anyway, was also Greystone. She went back further, pulled every acquisition file from the past 3 years. Every property Victor had championed, and he had championed every acquisition in that period. All 7 of them had been appraised by the same firm. Not rotated, not alternated. The same company, the same letterhead, the same signature on the certification page. She called Barb Overton. Before Victor handled acquisitions, how many appraisal firms did the company use? Barb did not need to check. 3. Your father rotated them every other deal. Said using one firm was like auditing your own homework. When did that change? About 3 years ago. Victor consolidated to Greystone. Said it was more efficient to build a single relationship. Brooke hung up. She sat in her office with the 7 files spread across her desk, Greystone's logo repeating across every cover page like a watermark. She could see the shape of something, one firm, every deal, prices that pushed above market. But she did not have the vocabulary to name it precisely. She was not an appraiser. She could spot a pattern, but she could not tell the board, with professional authority, that the valuations were wrong. Instinct was not evidence. A feeling about cap rates would not survive a legal challenge from an 18-year executive with 3 decades of acquisition history behind him. She needed someone who could look at a building, walk the floors, pull the comparables, and say with certified certainty whether $8.4 million was the truth or a performance. Someone trained to see what appraisals were hiding. She knew exactly one person who could do that. At 6:15 that evening, she walked to the maintenance shop on the south side of the building. The overhead fluorescents were off. A single work lamp burned near the back bench where Nolan was labeling bins of HVAC filters with a marker that was nearly dry. He looked up when she came in. He did not seem surprised. "If I showed you an appraisal," Brooke said, "could you tell me whether the numbers are real?" He set the marker down. He looked at her for a long moment, not at the question, but at what it would cost him to answer it. What it would mean to pick up the skill he had set down the day Catherine died and use it again, here for her. "That is what I used to do for a living." She held out the Midlothian file. He took it. Their fingers did not touch, but neither of them stepped back. The work lamp hummed between them. A truck shifted gears somewhere on the access road outside, and the sound faded, and neither of them moved until it was gone. Nolan spent 3 evenings at his kitchen table after Jake was asleep, surrounded by acquisition folders Barb had pulled without asking why. She had looked at him when he made the request, nodded once, and returned 20 minutes later with a banker's box and a sticky note that read, 7 deals. 3 years. All Victor. He started with the Midlothian warehouse. Drove out on a Saturday morning and walked the property for 2 hours, measuring ceiling clearances, checking column spacing, noting deferred maintenance on the loading docks and water infiltration stains on the east-facing walls. He photographed every structural element that mattered. Then he drove home, opened his laptop, and did what he had done 1,000 times in his former life. He pulled comparable sales from the county assessor's website, ran a capitalization rate analysis using trailing 12-month net operating income, cross-referenced with 3 recent transactions of similar properties within a 15-mile radius, one on Bells Road, one near the airport, one in eastern Henrico. He adjusted for condition, location, and tenant quality. His assessment, $5.1 million. 5.4, maybe, with aggressive assumptions about future occupancy and rent growth. Alderman Realty had paid $8.4 million. The overpayment was $3.3 million on a single property. He opened the next file. Same pattern. Greystone's appraisals consistently landed 30 to 40% above what the market data supported. Not randomly, not through differences in methodology. Systematically, the same inflation applied the same way across every deal Victor had championed. Then Nolan did what 11 years at a valuation firm had trained him to do when the numbers stopped making sense. He followed the money past the closing table. County records were public. Anyone with patience and a login could pull them. Within 60 days of each closing, the selling entity had issued a payment to a company called Lund Capital Advisors, LLC. The amounts ranged from $80,000 to $210,000. They appeared on every deal. 7 properties, 7 payments. The same LLC every time. Lund Capital Advisors was registered to a residential address in Chesterfield County. A property records search matched that address to the home of Victor Lund's brother. Nolan sat back from the table. The kitchen was dark except for the lamp. Jake's model airplane sat on the counter behind him, wings attached, paint drying. The refrigerator hummed. The total across 3 years, $4.2 million in kickbacks. Routed through a consulting LLC funded by sellers who had been overpaid with Alderman Realty's money, using appraisals inflated by a firm whose principal happened to be Victor Lund's college roommate. The scheme was clean, layered, and patient, and the only reason it had survived for 3 years was that no one at the company had the professional training to see what was sitting in plain view. He printed the report. 23 pages. Comparable sales. Cap rate analyses. County filings. Entity registrations. A timeline correlating each closing date with the corresponding payment to Lund Capital Advisors. He bound it with a binder clip and set it on the kitchen counter next to Jake's airplane. The next morning, he drove to the main office. Brooke was at her desk. He placed the report in front of her and stood on the other side, hands at his sides, and waited while she read. She went through it slowly, page by page. She did not skip ahead. When she reached the county filings showing the payments to Lund Capital Advisors, she stopped. Her hand pressed flat against the paper, palm down, steadying something that was not the page. "You could see this the whole time," she said quietly. "Every building you have been maintaining." "I stopped looking," Nolan said. "Until you asked." The room held still. What he had given her was not just evidence. It was the skill he had buried when Catherine died, pulled back out, and put to use for the first time in 3 years. And he had done it not because someone assigned the case, not because a federal agency compelled it, but because she had walked into his maintenance shop one evening and trusted him with a question she could not answer alone. He had looked again because she asked. That was the whole of it. Brooke did not bring the report to the board the next day. She spent 10 days verifying. She retained an independent MAI-certified appraisal firm headquartered in Washington, a company with no prior relationship to Alderman Realty, Victor Lund, or Greystone, and commissioned retroactive valuations on all 7 properties. She paid for the engagement out of the CEO discretionary budget and told no one on the board. The independent appraisals came back on a Thursday afternoon. Every property confirmed overvalued. Total overpayment across the portfolio, $11.2 million. The Washington firm's cover letter noted that the discrepancies were beyond the range of reasonable methodological disagreement. Brooke called an emergency board meeting for the following Monday. 7 members, in person, conference room doors closed. She had the independent appraisals printed and bound. She had the county records tabbed with yellow flags. She had Lund Capital Advisors entity registration highlighted and paperclipped to a map showing the Chesterfield address. She presented the findings in sequence. The independent appraisals first, clinical, numerical, printed in side-by-side columns against Greystone's original figures. Property by property, the discrepancies were laid bare. Midlothian, $3.3 million over market. Broad Street, $1.9. Hull Street Warehouse, $2.1. She went through all 7, her voice flat and measured, the numbers doing the work she did not need to do with tone. Then the county records showing the seller to LLC payments. Then the entity registration linking Lund Capital Advisors to Victor's brother's residential address. She placed each document on the table in order, the way Nolan had arranged the original report, sourced, sequential, and without interpretation. Victor sat at the far end of the conference table. He listened with his hands folded, the way he always sat in meetings, composed and patient. 18 years of boardroom discipline holding his posture in place. When Brooke finished, the room was still. The board chair asked for his response. "Market conditions," Victor said. His voice was steady. "Every acquisition was positioned aggressively. Yes. That is what growth looks like. Appraisal is subjective. Put 2 firms in the same building and they will disagree by 15, 20%. That is not fraud. That is professional judgment." 38%, Brooks said. Average deviation across 7 properties. And the payments to Lund Capital Advisors are not a matter of professional judgment. Victor's hands unfolded for the first time. He placed them flat on the table, then removed them. The board chair looked at the county filings, then at Victor, then at Brooke. "Who identified the discrepancy?" "Our maintenance supervisor," Brooks said. "He is also an MAI-certified appraiser with 11 years of experience in commercial valuation." The silence lasted 4 full seconds. 2 board members exchanged a glance. The chair removed his reading glasses and set them on the table, and when he spoke again his voice carried the particular weight of a man who has just realized he has been sitting across from a problem for 3 years without seeing it. The vote was 6-1. Victor Lund was suspended from all company operations, effective immediately, pending outside legal review and referral to the Virginia Attorney General. Victor gathered his jacket and phone. He walked toward the door without speaking. In the hallway he passed Nolan, who was standing near the elevator bank, hands in his pockets, available in case the board needed follow-up on methodology. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. The elevator arrived. Victor stepped in, and the doors closed between them. The counterattack came 9 days later. Victor's attorney filed a written statement with the board alleging the investigation was retaliatory, that the CEO had leveraged a personal relationship with a subordinate employee to target a senior executive who had previously raised concerns about her leadership. The statement referenced the holiday party. It referenced the HR review in December. It referenced Brooks' pattern of property visits in the weeks leading up to the audit. Visits that, per Victor's log, coincided with Nolan's on-site work schedule. The attorney did not use the word relationship. The document did not need to. The architecture of the argument carried the implication on its own. The board convened a review panel. They were obligated to. The panel examined the full timeline, the HR clearance from December, the sequence of events leading to the investigation, the sourcing methodology for every piece of evidence in Nolan's report, and the independence of the Washington appraisal firm. Their conclusion, delivered in a 6-page memorandum. The investigation was initiated by verifiable operational data, supported by publicly accessible county records, and validated by a third-party firm with no connection to either party. The personal acquaintance between the CEO and the employee, while noted, had no material impact on the evidentiary chain. Victor's attorney withdrew the statement the following week without public comment. The retaliation claim did not collapse with drama. It simply stopped being supportable, the way a building stops being viable when the foundation shifts, quietly, structurally, and without any single visible crack. On a Tuesday evening, 2 days after the withdrawal, Nolan found Brooke on the roof of an alderman property on Franklin Street. She was standing near the western edge, hands on the parapet cap, looking out over the city. The sun was low. The James River caught the last of the light in long copper bands, and the skyline stood dark against it. Warehouses and office towers, and the old medical building on Carey Street. All of them shapes Nolan could have priced in his sleep. He stood next to her. Not close, not far. The same careful distance they had been maintaining since December. "Why did you stop?" she asked. She was not talking about the investigation. Nolan looked out at the skyline. He could see 4 buildings from this rooftop that he had appraised in his former career. He knew their values the way a musician knows old songs. Automatically, involuntarily, whether he wanted to or not. The warehouse on Commerce Road. The mixed use on the canal. Every one of them a set of numbers that still ran in his head every time he drove past. He did not answer. He stood with his hands on the railing and looked at a city full of figures he had chosen to stop calculating. Somewhere below, a train crossed the viaduct, and the vibration came up through the parapet and into his palms. After a while, Brooke shifted her weight until her shoulder was close to his. Not touching, just close. She did not ask again. He did not offer anything more. The river went dark beneath them, and they stayed until the last of the light was gone. The following Saturday, Brooke came to Nolan's apartment for the first time. She arrived in the early afternoon. The place was small and clean. 2 bedrooms, a galley kitchen, a living room with a couch that had seen better years and a bookshelf that had not. Jake was at the kitchen table, in his usual spot, working on the model airplane that had taken nearly a month to finish. The fuselage was painted now, the wings balanced and sealed, and he was applying the final decals with a pair of tweezers and a focus that made the rest of the room disappear. Brooke sat across from him. She did not try too hard. She asked about the plane, what type it was, how long the build had taken, why he chose that particular model. Jake answered the way he answered everything. Carefully, with more detail than most adults expected from a 9-year-old, as if he had been waiting for someone willing to listen at his pace. Nolan stood in the kitchen doorway with a mug of coffee going cold in his hand, leaning against the frame the way he did when he was watching something he wanted to remember. He did not interrupt. He did not guide the conversation. He just watched his son explain to a woman he barely knew how to align a propeller hub using a straight edge and a ruler, and something in the apartment rearranged itself so quietly that none of them noticed it happening. 2 weeks later, the FBI formally opened an investigation into Lund Capital Advisors LLC. The charges, when they eventually came, would include wire fraud, commercial bribery, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. The inflated appraisals had been used to secure acquisition financing from 2 regional lenders, which extended the fraud beyond Alderman Realty and into the federal banking system. Victor Lund submitted his resignation the day after the subpoena was served. The letter was 3 sentences long and contained no acknowledgement of the charges. The board accepted it unanimously and without discussion. Greystone Appraisal LLC was placed under review by the Virginia Real Estate Appraiser Board. The principal, Victor's college roommate, retained counsel and declined all further comment. Brooke offered Nolan a new position, Director of Acquisitions, the title Victor Lund had held, a salary that reflected his credential and his experience. A corner office on the 3rd floor with a window that faced east and a view of the city he had spent a decade quietly appraising from the ground. He told her he would think about it. She nodded. She did not press. That night, after Jake was asleep, Nolan sat at the kitchen table in the glow of the lamp. The banker's box was gone, returned to Barb's records room. The model airplane sat on the counter, finished, balanced on its landing gear, catching the light. The apartment was quiet, the particular silence that falls after 9 o'clock in a home with 1 child and 1 parent, the kind that used to feel like absence and had slowly, over months, begun to feel like the natural end of a day. He sat there for a long time, looking at nothing in particular, thinking about value, about what things were worth, and who decided, and what it meant when you stopped needing to assign a number to everything in order to understand it. He did not call Brooke, but he left the Midlothian file open on his laptop, the one with his own notes in the margins, his own cap rate figures, his own handwriting for the first time in 3 years, and he looked at it until the coffee went cold, and then he closed the screen and turned off the light. 2 months later, the dogwoods along Monument Avenue were beginning to show the first pale green of early spring, the buds tight and deliberate the way Richmond does everything, slowly, and only when it is ready. Nolan had taken the position. There was no announcement, no ceremony. He simply stopped reporting to the maintenance bay and began showing up on the 3rd floor, in a corner office with that east-facing window and a desk that was still too clean. His name appeared on the building directory the following week. The first time he walked through the lobby in a collared shirt instead of a maintenance jacket, the security guard at the front desk looked up, looked back down at the directory, and looked up again. Nolan nodded. The guard nodded back. That was the whole of the transition. Jake and Brooke had built a Saturday routine without anyone formally establishing one. Monument Avenue in the morning, the wide tree-lined median with its old oaks and long shadows. Then coffee at a shop in Carytown that kept its door propped open whenever the weather allowed. Jake ordered hot chocolate. Brooke ordered a cordido. Nolan ordered black coffee and did not acknowledge that Jake always chose the same side of the booth as Brooke, or that Brooke always saved the last inch of her pastry and pushed the plate toward him without comment. 3 Saturdays in a row, the barista had their orders started before they reached the counter. On a Tuesday morning in late March, Nolan drove Jake to school. The route was the one they had taken for 2 years, Patterson Avenue to 3 Chopped, left at the light, right into the drop-off lane. Jake's backpack was between his feet, and the finished model airplane sat on the dashboard, sealed with 2 coats of matte varnish, the decals aligned to within a millimeter. He was bringing it in for a class presentation. "Is Brooke coming to dinner tonight?" Jake asked, without looking up from the plane. Nolan adjusted the rearview mirror. It did not need adjusting. "Get your backpack," he said. Jake picked up the airplane carefully, cradling it in both hands, and climbed out. He looked back once through the passenger window. Nolan lifted 2 fingers off the steering wheel. Jake nodded and walked toward the building, and Nolan sat in the drop-off lane watching until the doors closed behind him. Then he sat there a moment longer, hands on the wheel, thinking about nothing he could name and everything he did not need to. That evening, Nolan stood in Brooke's bedroom. The same room, the same dimensions, the same photograph of Robert's first property on the wall above the dresser, still slightly crooked, the way it had been the night everything started. But the curtains were different now, something thinner, lighter, something that let the spring dusk through the west-facing window and laid it across the hardwood in long amber bands. The season had changed. The room had not. The man standing in it had. His shoes were by the door. He had taken them off when he came in, not because she asked, not because the carpet required it, but because this time he knew exactly where he was, and he knew how long he intended to stay. Brooke appeared in the doorway, coffee in one hand, shoulder against the frame. The same angle, the same posture, as that December morning when he had opened his eyes in a room that was not his and not known whether the night before had been a beginning or an accident. 3 months had passed since then. 3 months of property walkthroughs and rooftop silences and county records and board meetings and Saturday mornings at a coffee shop in Carytown where a 9-year-old always sat on the same side of the booth as the woman his father had not yet found the words for. She looked at his shoes by the door. She looked at him sitting on the edge of the bed. She smiled. Last night was fun. Same words, different language entirely. He smiled back. Neither of them moved to close the distance. They did not need to. The distance had been closing on its own for months. In hallways and parking lots and maintenance shops. In a report built at a kitchen table after a boy fell asleep. In the silence on a rooftop above the James River when she asked why he stopped, and he could not answer because the answer was standing next to him. The first time, he had not meant to stay. This time, he had left his shoes by the door on purpose.